Hey everyone, tonight we're going to drift away from the dramatic chaos of Mount Olympus and settle into something much gentler. We're exploring the quieter moments of Greek mythology, the peaceful tales that somehow got overshadowed by all the lightning bolts and family drama. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture ancient Greece not during one of its legendary wars or divine catastrophes, but during those forgotten moments when even the gods took a breath. When Athena wasn't commanding armies or turning mortals into spiders, and when Apollo wasn't chasing reluctant lovers across mountainsides. These are the stories that the epic poets skipped over, the gentle interludes between the grand adventures. Tonight, we're focusing on wisdom and light, on the goddess who valued thought over thunder and the god who brought music to the world. Let's begin with Athena, though not the Athena you might expect. Not the warrior goddess springing fully formed from Zeus's head in gleaming armor. Instead, imagine her in the quiet hours before dawn, walking through the olive groves that she gifted to humanity. The silver leaves whisper in the morning breeze, and dewdrops catch the first rays of sunlight like tiny mirrors scattered across the earth. In these peaceful moments, Athena would often visit the mortal world not to intervene in wars or settle disputes, but simply to observe. She had a particular fondness for watching craftspeople at work. Potters shaping clay on their wheels, weavers creating intricate patterns on their looms, architects sketching plans for temples that would stand for centuries. There was something deeply satisfying about witnessing human creativity, the way mortals could take raw materials and transform them into something beautiful and functional. One morning, Athena found herself drawn to a small village nestled in a valley between rolling hills. The village was unremarkable by most standards. No famous heroes lived there, no great battles had been fought on its soil, and no other gods paid it any attention. But Athena noticed something special about this place. The people here seemed to understand the value of quiet dedication. She watched an elderly potter named Callias working at his wheel. His hands were gnarled with age, stained permanently with clay, but they moved with the confidence that comes from decades of practice. He wasn't creating anything revolutionary, just simple bowls and cups that would be used by his neighbors for their daily meals. But each piece was crafted with care, shaped with patience, finished with attention to detail that spoke of deep respect for his craft. Athena observed him for several days, invisible to mortal eyes, but present nonetheless. She noticed how Callias would arrive at his workshop before sunrise, how he would run his fingers along the clay to test its readiness, how he would pause occasionally to study a piece from different angles, making tiny adjustments that only an experienced eye would recognize as necessary. There was wisdom in his work, the kind of practical knowledge that couldn't be learned from books or passed down through divine revelation. On the fourth day of her observation, Athena decided to reveal herself. She appeared not in her usual imposing form, but as an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair tied back simply. Callias looked up from his wheel, startled but not afraid. There was something about her presence that felt familiar, comforting even, though he couldn't quite place why. "Your work is beautiful," she said, gesturing to the rows of pottery drying on wooden shelves around the workshop. Each piece tells a story of patience and skill. Callias smiled, wiping his clay-covered hands on a well-worn cloth. "Thank you, grandmother, though I fear my pieces are nothing special, just everyday vessels for everyday people." "That's precisely what makes them special," Athena replied, moving closer to examine a small oil lamp he had just finished shaping. The lamp was elegant in its simplicity, with clean lines and a perfectly balanced form. You understand something that many craftspeople forget. Beauty doesn't require complexity. Sometimes the most profound art is found in perfecting the simple things that make life a little easier, a little more pleasant. They talked for hours as Callias continued his work. Athena shared stories of other craftspeople she had encountered over the centuries, speaking of techniques and traditions that had been passed down through generations. She told him about the first weavers who had learned to create patterns that told stories, about metal workers who could forge tools so perfectly balanced they felt like extensions of the user's own hands, about stone workers who could read the grain of marble like others read scrolls. Callias listened with the attention of someone who truly understood the value of knowledge. He asked thoughtful questions, not about divine secrets or magical techniques, but about the practical wisdom that could help him improve his craft. How did the weavers of old maintain such consistent tension in their threads? What did the ancient metalworkers know about tempering that had been forgotten over time? As the sun reached its peak and began its slow descent toward the horizon, Athena prepared to leave. But before she departed, she placed her hand gently on Callias's shoulder. "Your dedication to your craft honors all who came before you," she said. "Continue as you have been. The world needs more people who understand that excellence is found in the daily practice of doing good work with careful attention." Callias felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of connection to something larger than his small workshop and quiet village. He didn't know he had been speaking with Athena herself, but he understood that he had been blessed with wisdom that would guide his hands for the rest of his days. From that day forward, his pottery seemed to possess an extra quality, a subtle perfection that made even simple bowls feel special in the hands of those who used them. This was Athena in her gentlest aspect, not the strategist planning battles or the judge pronouncing verdicts, but the goddess who appreciated the quiet dignity of honest work. She understood that civilization wasn't built only by heroes and kings, but by countless ordinary people who took pride in doing their jobs well, who passed their knowledge to the next generation, who found beauty in the intersection of function and form. In the evenings, Athena would sometimes visit libraries and schools, places where knowledge was preserved and shared. She would walk unseen among the scrolls, listening to teachers explain mathematics to eager students, watching scholars debate philosophy by lamplight, observing scribes carefully copying important texts to preserve them for future generations. There was a particular school in Athens where she often lingered. The teacher there was a woman named Sophia, which seemed almost too perfect, given that it meant wisdom. Sophia had an unusual approach to education. Rather than simply lecturing her students, she would ask them questions that made them think deeply about what they already knew. She would present them with problems that had no easy answers, encouraging them to discuss and debate until they reached their own conclusions. Athena admired this method. True wisdom couldn't be simply poured from one mind into another like water from one vessel to another. It had to be cultivated, nurtured, allowed to grow through practice and reflection. Sophia understood this instinctively, even without divine guidance. One evening, as Sophia was preparing lessons for the following day by the light of several oil lamps, Athena appeared to her as a middle-aged woman dressed in the simple robes of a scholar. Sophia looked up from her scrolls, curious but unafraid. "I've been watching your teaching methods," Athena said, settling onto a wooden stool across from Sophia's desk. "You have an interesting approach to education." Sophia set down her reed pen and gave her visitor her full attention. "I've found that students learn better when they discover things for themselves. I can tell them that the angles of a triangle always add up to the same amount. But if they work through the proof themselves, they truly understand it. The knowledge becomes part of them in a way that mere memorization never could. Wise words, Athena replied. But doesn't this method take much longer? You could cover more material if you simply told them the answers. Sophia considered this question seriously. Perhaps I could cover more topics, but would they really learn more? I think there's a difference between knowing something and understanding it. When students struggle with a concept and finally grasp it through their own effort, they remember it forever. They also develop the skills to tackle new problems on their own. Athena nodded approvingly. You understand something important about the nature of wisdom. It's not a collection of facts to be memorized, but a way of thinking to be developed. The process of learning is often more valuable than any specific thing that's learned. They spent the night discussing education, philosophy, and the challenge of preparing young minds for the complexities of adult life. Sophia shared her observations about how different students learned in different ways, some through hearing, others through seeing, still others through hands-on experience. She talked about the importance of encouraging questions, even when those questions challenged established ideas. Athena found herself energized by the conversation. Here was a mortal who truly understood the essence of wisdom, not as something to be hoarded by the wise, but as something to be shared and cultivated in others. As dawn approached, she prepared to leave, but not before offering some guidance. Continue your work, she told Sophia. The methods you've developed will influence generations of students. Some of them will become teachers themselves, and they'll pass on not just knowledge, but the love of learning that you've instilled in them. That's the truest form of immortality. Sophia felt inspired and renewed, though she didn't fully understand why. The mysterious visitor had asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to her answers, validating approaches that sometimes drew criticism from more traditional educators. From that night forward, Sophia's confidence in her methods grew stronger, and her students seemed to respond with even greater enthusiasm. These quiet moments of connection between the goddess and mortals who embodied her values were precious to Athena. They reminded her why wisdom was worth protecting and promoting. It wasn't about being cleverer than others or winning arguments, but about the deep satisfaction that came from understanding how things worked, from solving problems, from creating something useful and beautiful. Now, let's turn our attention to Apollo, but not the Apollo of blazing chariots racing across the sky or dramatic confrontations with mortals who dared challenge his musical prowess. Instead, picture him in the gentle hours of twilight, when the sun's work is done and the world settles into the soft embrace of evening. This is Apollo at his most peaceful, the god who understood that true power sometimes lies in restraint, that the most beautiful music often comes from the spaces between the notes. There was a grove sacred to Apollo on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, not far from the famous oracle at Delphi. But this wasn't the grand temple complex with its imposing columns and crowds of pilgrims seeking prophecies. This was a quieter place, a natural amphitheater formed by ancient olive trees whose branches created a canopy of silver-green leaves. Here, Apollo would come when he needed to remember why music mattered, why poetry was more than just pretty words arranged in pleasing patterns. The grove had a particular quality of acoustics that made even whispered words carry clearly across the space. Apollo had discovered this place centuries ago, during one of his wanderings through the mortal world. He had been feeling restless, dissatisfied with the grand performances and elaborate ceremonies that usually surrounded his appearances. There was something about the constant adoration, the way mortals trembled in his presence, that made him long for simpler interactions. On this particular evening, Apollo materialized in the grove not as the radiant god of sun and music, but as a young man with calloused fingers and travel-worn clothes. His lyre was still magnificent, but he carried it casually, like a craftsman might carry his tools. He settled onto a moss-covered boulder and began to tune the strings, not preparing for any grand performance, but simply enjoying the pure tones that rang out in the still air. As he played, Apollo found himself thinking about the nature of music itself. In the grand halls of Olympus, music was often about display, about demonstrating power and skill. The other gods appreciated technical perfection, complex harmonies, innovative compositions that showcased divine creativity. But here, in this quiet grove, Apollo remembered something he had almost forgotten. Music was also about connection, about touching something deep in the listener's soul that had nothing to do with technical prowess. He began with simple melodies, songs that seemed to grow naturally from the rhythm of his heartbeat, from the gentle stirring of leaves in the evening breeze. These weren't compositions designed to impress anyone. They were expressions of the contentment that comes from being present in a beautiful moment, from feeling the weight of the day settling into peaceful rest. As Apollo played, he became aware that he wasn't alone. A young shepherd had been leading his flock down the mountain path when the sound of the lyre reached his ears. The music was unlike anything he had ever heard, not because it was complex or showy, but because it seemed to speak directly to something inside him that he hadn't even known was there. The shepherd, whose name was Lycaon, stood at the edge of the grove, afraid to enter but unable to walk away. His sheep gathered around him, also seeming to sense that something special was happening. Even they had grown still, their usual bleating replaced by an attentive silence. Apollo noticed his audience but didn't stop playing. Instead, he shifted his melody slightly, incorporating rhythms that matched the gentle movement of the flock, harmonies that seemed to echo the quiet satisfaction of a day's work well done. The music became a conversation between the god and the shepherd, though Lycaon didn't realize he was participating. When the last notes faded into the gathering darkness, Apollo set his lyre aside and smiled at the young man. "Your flock is well cared for," he observed, noting the healthy condition of the sheep and the gentle way they responded to their shepherd's presence. Lycaon approached hesitantly, drawn by the stranger's kind voice and peaceful demeanor. "Thank you, sir. They're good sheep, not much trouble. But your music, I've never heard anything like it. It made me feel like I was hearing my own thoughts put to melody." "That's the highest compliment a musician can receive," Apollo replied. "Music isn't really about the notes themselves, you know. It's about the feelings and memories and dreams that the notes awaken in the listener. The best songs are the ones that help people understand something about themselves they couldn't quite put into words. They talked as the stars began to appear overhead. Lycaon shared stories of his life on the mountain, the challenges of caring for his flock, the satisfaction of watching young lambs grow strong under his protection. Apollo listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he understood the dignity and importance of the shepherd's work. "People in the village sometimes mock me," Lycaon admitted. "They say shepherding is simple work, that anyone could do it, but they don't understand how much attention it requires. You have to know each animal's personality, watch for signs of illness, understand the weather patterns, know which pastures are best at different times of year. And you have to really care about their well-being, not just see them as a source of wool and milk." Apollo nodded thoughtfully. Every honest profession requires its own form of wisdom. The people who mock shepherding probably couldn't last a week doing your job. There's as much skill in reading the mood of a flock as there is in reading an audience before a performance. Both require patience, observation, and genuine concern for those in your care. As the night deepened, Apollo began to play again, but this time he invited Lycaon to join him. The shepherd protested that he knew nothing about music, but Apollo handed him a simple wooden flute he had crafted earlier. Don't worry about playing it correctly, Apollo said. Just listen to what I'm playing and add whatever feels right to you. Music isn't about rules and techniques. It's about expression and connection. Tentatively, Lycaon raised the flute to his lips. The first notes were uncertain, breathy, but Apollo adjusted his lyre, playing to support and encourage the shepherd's efforts. Gradually, Lycaon's confidence grew. He found rhythms that matched his breathing, melodies that seemed to flow from his understanding of natural cycles, harmonies that spoke of quiet contentment and simple joys. Together, they created music that neither could have made alone. Apollo's divine skill provided a foundation of beauty and complexity, while Lycaon's authentic emotion gave the performance a quality of honesty that even the gods' most polished compositions sometimes lacked. It was a collaboration between the immortal and the mortal, between sophisticated technique and pure feeling. Other creatures of the night began to gather at the edges of the grove. Deer emerged from the deeper forest, drawn by the peaceful energy of the music. Night birds added their own voices to the harmony. Even the sheep had arranged themselves in a comfortable circle, some lying down to rest, while others stood with their heads raised, as if actively listening. This was Apollo at his most genuine, not performing for admiration or demonstrating his superiority over mortal musicians, but simply sharing the joy of music with someone who appreciated it. He found himself remembering why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, back in the early days of the world when every song was an experiment, every melody a discovery. As the night wore on, their impromptu concert gradually wound down to softer, more contemplative pieces. Apollo taught Lycaon some simple songs that shepherds had been singing for generations, melodies that helped pass the long hours of watching over flocks, that carried stories and wisdom from older shepherds to younger ones. Music is one of the few things that becomes more beautiful when it's shared, Apollo observed as they prepared to part ways. A song sung alone can be lovely, but a song shared between friends becomes something larger than either singer could create alone. Lycaon carefully tucked the wooden flute into his shepherd's pouch, treating it like the precious gift it was. "Will I see you again?" he asked, though something in the stranger's manner suggested that this meeting was both more and less than it appeared. "Perhaps," Apollo said with a gentle smile. "But even if our paths don't cross again, you'll carry this music with you. And someday you might share it with another young shepherd, or play it for your children, or use it to comfort the sheep during difficult nights. That's how music stays alive, not in grand concert halls, but in the daily lives of people who understand its true value." As Apollo prepared to depart, he left behind more than just the flute. Lycaon would find that his natural ability to read the moods and needs of his flock had somehow deepened. His understanding of weather patterns became more intuitive. His voice, when he sang to calm, nervous sheep or encourage stragglers, carried a new quality that seemed to reach directly to the animals' hearts. But perhaps most importantly, Lycaon carried with him the memory of that perfect evening when music had built a bridge between two very different lives. He would never know that his mysterious companion had been Apollo himself, but he would always remember the lesson that true artistry comes not from showing off, but from opening one's heart to share something beautiful with others. Something beautiful with others. Years later, when Lycaon had become an elder shepherd himself, he would often bring his own students to that same grove on Mount Parnassus. He would teach them the songs Apollo had shared with him, though he always spoke of his teacher simply as a traveling musician who understood the heart of music. The wooden flute had been carefully preserved and was passed down through generations of shepherds, each one adding their own melodies to its repertoire. Apollo continued to visit the grove regularly, drawn back by the peace he found there and the memories of genuine connection. Sometimes he would encounter other travelers, other souls seeking something they couldn't quite name. There was the young weaver who had lost confidence in her abilities after a harsh critique from a master craftsman. Apollo spent an evening with her, helping her understand that the slight irregularities in her work weren't flaws but signatures, proof that human hands had touched the cloth with care and attention. He met an elderly scribe whose eyesight was failing, who feared that his life's work of copying important texts would soon come to an end. Apollo showed him how knowledge could be preserved in other ways, how the stories and wisdom he had absorbed through decades of careful copying could be shared through spoken word, how his understanding of language and literature made him a valuable teacher, even if his hands could no longer form perfect letters. Each encounter reminded Apollo of something essential about his role as god of music, poetry, and enlightenment. His true power wasn't in his ability to outshine mortal musicians or compose works of impossible complexity. It was in his capacity to recognize and nurture the spark of creativity that existed in every human soul, to help people discover their own authentic voices rather than trying to imitate divine perfection. One autumn evening, Apollo found himself in the grove with a different kind of visitor. She was a young woman named Penthesilea, though this wasn't the famous Amazon queen of the same name, just a village girl with an unusual problem. She had been born with a beautiful singing voice, so beautiful that people would stop whatever they were doing just to listen when she sang. But rather than bringing her joy, this gift had become a burden. "Everyone expects so much from me," she confided to the stranger she found sitting beneath the olive trees. "When I sing in the temple, people weep. When I sing at festivals, they act as if something divine has touched them. But I feel like a fraud. I don't feel divine when I sing. I just feel like myself, and that doesn't seem like enough to justify all their reverence." Apollo listened with particular attention, recognizing in her words something of his own struggles with the weight of divine expectation. "What do you feel when you sing?" he asked gently. Penthesilea considered the question seriously. "Joy, mostly, and a kind of completeness, as if the song is something that was always inside me, waiting to come out. When I'm singing, I feel most like myself, if that makes any sense. But then people start talking about gifts from the gods and divine inspiration, and I wonder if maybe I'm supposed to feel something more elevated, more spiritual. What if the joy and completeness you feel is exactly what you're supposed to feel?" Apollo suggested. "What if the divine aspect isn't something separate from your natural self, but something that emerges when you're most authentically who you are?" They talked late into the night about the relationship between natural talent and divine inspiration, about the difference between performing for others' expectations and singing from one's own truth. Apollo helped Penthesilea understand that the power of her voice came not from some external blessing, but from her willingness to be completely present and honest when she sang. "The gods don't make music," he explained, speaking more truth than she could possibly realize. "We inspire it. Sometimes we guide it. But the music itself comes from mortal hearts and mortal experiences. Your voice moves people because it carries your authentic emotions, your genuine understanding of what it means to be human. That's something no divine being can replicate." As the years passed, Apollo began to notice changes in how mortals approached music and art. The stories of his dramatic contests with mortals like Marsyas had spread, often growing more exaggerated with each retelling. Young musicians increasingly seemed motivated by fear rather than love, afraid of divine punishment if they showed too much confidence in their abilities, afraid to explore their own creative instincts lest they accidentally challenge a god. This troubled Apollo deeply. Art created from fear was hollow, no matter how technically proficient it might be. The whole point of music and poetry was to explore the full range of human experience, to push boundaries, to ask difficult questions. But mortals were becoming increasingly conservative in their artistic choices, playing it safe rather than risking divine displeasure. So Apollo began to change his approach. Instead of appearing as himself, with all the intimidating presence that divine identity brought, he started visiting mortal communities disguised as a traveling teacher. He would spend weeks or months in a place, working with local musicians and poets, encouraging them to trust their instincts, to take creative risks, to find their own voices rather than trying to imitate divine or classical models. In a coastal village known for its fishing fleet, Apollo worked with a group of sailors who had developed their own unique style of work songs. These weren't refined compositions suitable for temple ceremonies, but rough, rhythmic chants designed to coordinate the hauling of nets and the raising of sails. The local music teacher had been trying to improve these songs by adding formal harmonies and classical structures, but Apollo encouraged the sailors to preserve their original style. "These songs grew from your work," he told them during an evening gathering on the beach. "They have a power and authenticity that comes from real experience. Don't let anyone convince you that music has to be complicated to be valuable. The rhythm that helps you work together, the melody that makes long hours at sea pass more quickly, the words that tell the stories of your fathers and grandfathers, these are as important as any composition performed in marble halls." He helped them understand how their work songs connected them to an ancient tradition of labor music, how fishermen and farmers and craftspeople throughout history had used music to make their work easier and their communities stronger. By the time he left the village, the sailors had not only preserved their traditional songs, but had begun creating new ones, confident in their own musical instincts. In a mountain community known for its metal workers, Apollo encountered a different kind of artistic crisis. The local smiths had developed a tradition of decorating their finest pieces with intricate patterns, but a visiting scholar had criticized their designs as primitive and unsophisticated compared to the geometric patterns favored in major cities. The smiths were abandoning their traditional motifs in favor of copying urban styles that felt foreign and awkward in their hands. Apollo, appearing as an itinerant craftsman with the knowledge of metalworking techniques, spent several weeks working alongside the local smiths. He helped them analyze their traditional patterns, showing them how these designs reflected the natural forms they saw every day in their mountain environment, how the flowing lines echoed the movement of streams and the shapes of leaves, how the spiral motifs captured the energy of wind patterns and seasonal cycles. "Your patterns tell the story of this place," he explained as they worked together at the forge. "An urban smith might create beautiful geometric designs, but they could never create these patterns because they don't see what you see every day. Your designs carry the wisdom of generations who lived in these mountains, who understood the rhythms of this particular landscape. That's not primitive, that's profound." The smiths gradually regained confidence in their traditional aesthetic, but with a new understanding of why their patterns worked so well. They began experimenting with variations and innovations within their established style, creating pieces that honored their heritage while expressing their own creative visions. These experiences taught Apollo something important about his role as a god of the arts. His job wasn't to set absolute standards for artistic excellence, or to judge mortal creativity against divine perfection. Instead, his purpose was to help mortals discover and trust their own creative instincts, to encourage artistic exploration rather than artistic conformity. He began to see himself less as the supreme musician whose performances mortals should aspire to match, and more as a gardener of creativity, someone whose job was to provide the right conditions for artistic growth. Like Athena with her craftspeople, Apollo found deep satisfaction in nurturing mortal talent rather than simply demonstrating his own superiority. The grove on Mount Parnassus became his retreat and laboratory, a a place where he could process these insights and plan his next interventions in the mortal world. Sometimes he would bring his lyre and play not for any audience, but simply for the joy of making music in a beautiful place. Other times he would sit in silence, listening to the natural sounds of the grove and thinking about the delicate balance between inspiration and instruction, between divine guidance and mortal independence. One night, as Apollo sat beneath the ancient olive trees, he was joined by his sister Artemis. She appeared not as the fearsome huntress, but in her gentler aspect as protector of young creatures and guardian of natural places. Brother and sister sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the soft sounds of the night forest. "You've been spending a lot of time in the mortal world lately," Artemis observed, though there was no criticism in her voice, only curiosity. Apollo nodded thoughtfully. "I've been learning things I never understood before, about the difference between power and influence, between impressing people and actually helping them. The mortals are teaching me as much as I'm teaching them." Artemis smiled, understanding completely. Her own interactions with mortals had evolved similarly over the centuries, from dramatic interventions to subtle guidances, from punishing those who offended her to protecting those who needed her help. "Father thinks we're going soft," she said with gentle amusement. "He doesn't understand why we don't demand the same level of fear and reverence that we used to." "Maybe we're not going soft," Apollo replied. "Maybe we're growing wise. True strength doesn't need to announce itself constantly. True power is often most effective when it's exercised with restraint." They continued talking through the night, sharing stories of their recent experiences with mortals, comparing insights about the changing relationship between gods and humans. Both had discovered that the most meaningful interactions came not when mortals cowered before divine power, but when they felt safe enough to be authentically themselves in the presence of the divine. As dawn approached and Artemis prepared to return to her own wanderings, she left Apollo with a thought that would stay with him for centuries to come. "Perhaps," she said, "the greatest gift we can give mortals isn't our power, but our attention. Not our abilities, but our understanding. Maybe what they need most from us is simply to be seen and valued for who they are, not judged for who they're not." Apollo carried this wisdom back into his work with mortal musicians and poets. He began to approach each encounter not with the agenda to teach or improve, but with genuine curiosity about what he could learn from the unique perspective each mortal brought to their art. This shift in approach transformed not only his relationships with humans, but his understanding of creativity itself. The village of Thessaly sat nestled between two gentle hills, unremarkable except for its reputation as a place where dreams came true. Not through magic or divine intervention, but through the simple dedication of its people to their crafts and trades. Apollo had heard whispers of this place during his travels, stories of artisans who seemed to understand something fundamental about the relationship between skill and soul. He arrived on a morning when mist still clung to the valley floor, transforming the village into something ethereal and dreamlike. The cobblestone streets were already alive with activity despite the early hour. Bakers pulled fresh loaves from their ovens, filling the air with the warm scent of bread. Farmers guided carts laden with vegetables toward the market square. Children ran between the adults, their laughter mixing with the general hum of productive activity. What struck Apollo immediately was the quality of contentment that seemed to permeate everything. These weren't people driven by desperate ambition or grinding necessity. They worked with purpose and pleasure, taking visible pride in whatever they were creating. A young woman arranging flowers outside a temple hummed as she worked, unconsciously creating melodies that perfectly matched the rhythm of her movements. An elderly carpenter shaped wood with strokes so precise and confident they seemed more like dance steps than labor. Apollo made his way to the village's small amphitheater, a circular space carved into the hillside where the community gathered for festivals and celebrations. Even empty, it possessed remarkable acoustic properties. The morning breeze seemed to gather itself here before dispersing throughout the village, carrying with it the sounds of daily life transformed into something approaching music. He settled onto one of the stone benches and began to play his lyre, not loudly or dramatically, but with the gentle persistence of morning light gradually filling a room. The melodies he chose were simple enough that anyone could follow them, complex enough to reward careful listening. He played songs about beginnings and daily routines, about the satisfaction of work well done and the quiet pleasure of community. Gradually, people began to notice the music drifting through the village. They didn't abandon their work to come running, but they did slow their pace slightly, allowing themselves to really listen. A baker paused in his kneading to appreciate a particularly beautiful phrase. A mother carrying water from the well found her steps naturally falling into rhythm with the melody. Two children playing in the street stopped their game and tilted their heads like small birds trying to identify an unfamiliar but pleasant song. After about an hour, a small group had gathered near the amphitheater. They sat on the grass or leaned against trees, not watching Apollo with the intense focus of an audience expecting entertainment, but listening with the relaxed attention of people who had found a moment of beauty in their day and wanted to savor it. Among the listeners was an old man whose gnarled hands spoke of decades of some kind of fine work. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, and he carried himself with the dignity that comes from mastering a craft. When Apollo finished his current song, the old man spoke up. "That melody reminds me of something my grandfather used to play," he said, his voice carrying easily across the amphitheater's perfect acoustics. He was a luthier, made instruments for musicians throughout the region. He used to say that wood had its own music trapped inside, and his job was just to set it free. Apollo smiled and gestured for the old man to join him in the center of the space. "Would you share one of your grandfather's melodies? I'd be honored to accompany you." The old man, who introduced himself as Demetrius, looked uncertain. "I'm not much of a performer. These hands are better suited to carving than playing. But I do remember some of the songs." "Then let's make music together," Apollo said. "I'll follow your lead." What followed was unlike any performance Apollo had given in centuries. Demetrius sang in a voice weathered by age but still true, melodies that spoke of ancient traditions and accumulated wisdom. The songs weren't sophisticated by formal standards, but they carried something more valuable than technical perfection. They held the essence of lived experience, the accumulated joy and sorrow of generations who had found meaning in honest work and simple pleasures. Apollo's lyre provided gentle support, never overwhelming Demetrius's voice but always enhancing it. He found himself learning as much as he was contributing, discovering melodic variations he never would have imagined on his own. The old man's understanding of rhythm came not from musical training, but from the natural cadences of craftsmanship, the steady progress of chisel through wood, the patient repetition of techniques passed down through generations. Other villagers began to join in as they recognized familiar songs. A young mother added harmonies her own mother had taught her. A group of children contributed clapping rhythms they had learned in their games. What began as a simple sharing between two people gradually became a community celebration, not planned or organized, but growing naturally from the music itself. This was Apollo's gift at its most refined, not the overwhelming power that demanded worship, but the subtle influence that encouraged mortals to discover their own voices. He didn't lead this impromptu concert so much as facilitate it, creating space for others to contribute their own musical understanding. As the morning progressed, more people joined the gathering. They brought their own instruments: simple flutes carved from reeds, small drums made from stretched animal hide, wooden clappers that added percussion to the growing symphony. None of these instruments were particularly sophisticated, but each carried the character of its maker and player. A young blacksmith named Alexandros brought a collection of metal rods of different lengths that produced clear, bell-like tones when struck. He had created them originally as a way to test the quality of his metalwork, but had discovered they could be arranged to play simple melodies. The sounds they made were unlike anything in traditional music, but they added a unique voice to the community's repertoire. Apollo was fascinated by this innovation. Here was someone who had discovered music not through formal training or divine inspiration, but through curiosity about the properties of his craft materials. Alexandros had taken something purely functional and found beauty hidden within it, transforming a quality control tool into an instrument of expression. "How did you discover that these could make music?" Apollo asked during a brief pause in the playing. Alexandros looked slightly embarrassed. "It was an accident, really. I was testing some rods to make sure they had been properly tempered, and I noticed they made different pitches depending on their length. I started arranging them by tone, and before I knew it, I was picking out melodies I remembered from childhood. My wife thought I was going mad, spending my evenings in the forge making music with metal scraps." "Your wife was wrong," Apollo said firmly. "You were discovering something profound about the relationship between craft and art. Every material has its own voice, its own musical possibilities. Most people never think to listen for those voices, but you did." This was exactly what Apollo had come to understand about the nature of creativity. It wasn't something that descended from above like lightning from Zeus's hand. It emerged from curiosity, from careful attention to the world, from the willingness to explore and experiment. Alexandros had become a musician not by abandoning his identity as a blacksmith, but by fully embracing it and discovering the artistic possibilities hidden within his craft. As the day wore on, the impromptu concert evolved into something more like a festival. People brought food to share, creating a communal meal around the music. Conversations sprang up between songs, with villagers sharing stories about their work, their families, their hopes for the coming seasons. Apollo found himself drawn into these discussions, not as a god dispensing wisdom, but as a fellow traveler interested in learning about different ways of living. He met Lydia, a weaver whose tapestries told stories of village life, with threads dyed in colors she had discovered through years of experimentation with local plants. She explained how different mordants affected the way colors took to fabric, how the time of year when plants were harvested influenced their dye potential, how the tension of the warp threads could change the entire character of a finished piece. "People think weaving is just about following patterns," she said, as she showed Apollo a tapestry depicting the village market on a busy morning. "But really, it's about understanding how all these variables work together. The thread, the dye, the loom, the weaver's mood, even the humidity in the air, they all contribute to the final result. No two pieces are ever exactly the same, even when you're trying to repeat yourself." Apollo studied the tapestry with genuine admiration. The scene was rendered with remarkable skill, but what impressed him most was the emotional quality of the work. Lydia had captured not just the visual appearance of market day, but its energy and atmosphere. You could almost hear the voices of the vendors, smell the bread and vegetables, feel the excitement of people coming together to share news and conduct business. "This is storytelling," he told her. "You're not just depicting a scene, you're preserving a moment in time." Future generations will be able to look at this and understand something essential about what life was like in your village." Lydia smiled with pleasure at the recognition. "That's exactly what I hope to accomplish. I want my grandchildren to know how beautiful ordinary days could be, how much life there was in simple activities like buying bread or greeting neighbors." This perspective resonated deeply with Apollo. Here was someone who understood that divinity could be found in everyday moments, that the sacred and the mundane weren't separate categories but different ways of seeing the same reality. Lydia's tapestries were devotional works in their own way, celebrations of the beauty that existed in common human experiences. As evening approached and the community gathering began to wind down, Apollo found himself reluctant to leave. This day had reminded him of something essential about his purpose as god of music and inspiration. His role wasn't to create beauty for mortals to admire from a distance, but to help them recognize and cultivate the beauty that already existed in their own lives and communities. The people of Thessaly hadn't needed divine intervention to create their remarkable culture of craftsmanship and mutual appreciation. They had done it themselves, through generations of careful attention to their work and genuine care for one another. Apollo's contribution had simply been to provide a catalyst, a moment of musical connection that allowed their existing creativity to flow more freely. Before departing, Apollo spent a few minutes alone with Demetrius, the elderly luthier's grandson who had initiated the day's music-making. The old man had been watching the festivities with the satisfied expression of someone who had witnessed something precious and unexpected. "Thank you for sharing your grandfather's songs," Apollo said. "They carried something that no formal composition could match." Demetrius nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather used to say that the best music wasn't made by performers for audiences, but by communities for themselves. He believed that when people made music together, they were practicing something essential about how to live together." "Your grandfather was wise," Apollo replied. "Music doesn't just reflect community, it creates it. When people listen to each other, respond to each other, build something together that none of them could make alone, they're learning the skills that make civilization possible." As Apollo prepared to leave Thessaly, he carried with him a renewed understanding of his own purpose and power. The day had shown him that his greatest influence came not from displays of divine supremacy, but from moments of genuine connection and shared creativity. The music he had facilitated would continue long after his departure, as villagers taught songs to their children and incorporated new rhythms into their work and celebrations. This was immortality of a different kind than the gods usually sought. Not the immortality of being remembered and worshipped, but the immortality of having contributed something valuable to the ongoing human conversation about beauty, meaning, and connection. The songs shared that day would evolve and spread, carrying with them the spirit of community and creative collaboration that had made them possible. Apollo's visits to mortal communities began to take on this quality more and more frequently. Rather than arriving with predetermined lessons to teach or demonstrations to give, he approached each encounter with curiosity about what he might learn and contribute. This shift in perspective transformed both his relationships with mortals and his understanding of his own divine nature. In a coastal village known for its skilled sailors, he learned sea shanties that helped coordinate complex nautical maneuvers while maintaining morale during long voyages. In a mountain community of goat herders, he discovered calling songs that could carry messages across vast distances, turning the landscape itself into a musical instrument. Each tradition taught him something new about the relationship between music and human necessity, between art and survival. But perhaps most importantly, these experiences reminded Apollo that creativity was not a finite resource to be hoarded or rationed. The more freely it was shared, the more abundantly it flowed. Every person he encouraged to trust their own artistic instincts became a source of inspiration for others. Every community that learned to value its own cultural expressions became more resilient and more connected. As he made his way back to Olympus after another extended journey through the mortal world, Apollo reflected on how much his understanding of divine responsibility had evolved. The old model of godhood, based on power and fear, and the maintenance of strict hierarchies, was giving way to something more collaborative and nurturing. Gods could be gardeners of human potential rather than judges of human worthiness. This gentler approach to divinity required different skills and offered different satisfactions than the traditional model. Instead of the immediate gratification that came from displays of overwhelming power, it offered the deeper pleasure of watching mortals discover their own capabilities and create things of lasting beauty. Instead of commanding worship through fear, it invited genuine appreciation through service. When Apollo finally returned to Mount Parnassus and his beloved grove, he found the space exactly as he had left it, but somehow enriched by all the experiences he had carried back with him. The olive trees seemed to whisper with the voices of all the mortals he had encountered. The acoustic properties of the natural amphitheater now reminded him of community gatherings in dozens of villages, and his lyre felt heavier with the weight of all the melodies it had learned to play. He settled onto his favorite boulder and began to play, not for any audience, but simply for the joy of making music in a place that had witnessed so many moments of connection and discovery. The songs that flowed from his strings were neither purely divine nor purely mortal, but something that emerged from the space between those categories, the place where gods and humans met as fellow creators in the ongoing work of making the world more beautiful. Beautiful. The music that Apollo created in those quiet moments belonged to no particular tradition or formal structure. It was improvisation in its purest form. Melodies that grew from the intersection of memory and possibility. Harmonies that reflected the accumulated wisdom of countless encounters with mortal creativity. Each note carried echoes of the conversations he'd shared, the lessons he'd learned, the connections he'd facilitated between people who might otherwise have remained strangers to one another. As he played, Apollo found himself thinking about the nature of inspiration itself. For so long, he had understood his role as the source from which creative fire flowed to grateful mortals. But his recent experiences had revealed a different truth. Inspiration wasn't something that moved in only one direction, from divine to mortal. It was more like a conversation, a continuous exchange where each participant contributed something unique and valuable. The shepherd Lycaon had taught Apollo about the music that emerged from patient observation of natural cycles. The blacksmith Alexandros had shown him how functional materials could be transformed into instruments of beauty. The weaver Lydia had demonstrated how everyday scenes could become profound statements about the value of ordinary life. Each encounter had added new dimensions to Apollo's understanding of what music could be and do. This realization led Apollo to a deeper appreciation of the collaborative nature of all artistic creation. Even when mortals worked alone, they were building on traditions passed down through generations, responding to cultural needs and opportunities, drawing on shared symbols and meanings that connected their individual expressions to larger human experiences. No one created in complete isolation, just as no musical performance truly took place in silence. There were always the invisible harmonies of context and tradition providing support and structure. In the months that followed, Apollo began to experiment with new ways of engaging with mortal communities. Rather than appearing as a mysterious stranger who offered wisdom and then departed, he started staying longer in the places he visited, becoming a temporary member of various communities and learning their rhythms from the inside. In a farming village, he spent an entire season working alongside the locals, learning the songs they sang while planting and harvesting. understanding how music helped coordinate group labor and maintain morale during difficult tasks. He discovered that the melodies used for different crops had evolved to match their specific requirements. Quick, energetic rhythms for tasks that needed to be completed rapidly. Slower, more meditative songs for work that required patience and careful attention. The farmers taught him about the musical qualities of agricultural work itself. The sound of scythes cutting through grain created natural percussion sections. The rhythm of multiple workers moving in coordination produced complex polyrhythmic patterns. Even the timing of when to plant and harvest followed musical principles, with experienced farmers able to sense the right moment by attending to subtle changes in the environment's overall composition. Apollo began to understand that these work songs represented a sophisticated form of musical education. Children learned them by joining in the labor, gradually acquiring not just technical skills, but an intuitive understanding of how individual efforts could combine to create something larger and more effective than the sum of its parts. The songs were repositories of practical knowledge, emotional support systems, and community bonding mechanisms all at once. This agricultural education in turn influenced Apollo's approach to teaching music in other contexts. He began to emphasize the collaborative aspects of musical creation, showing student musicians how to listen to and support each other rather than simply focusing on their individual performances. He introduced exercises that required participants to respond spontaneously to what others were playing, developing the kind of musical empathy that made true ensemble work possible. In a pottery-making community, Apollo learned about the relationship between rhythm and physical craft. The potters worked to internal rhythms that helped them maintain the consistent pressure and speed necessary for shaping clay. These rhythms weren't random. They had been developed over generations to match the optimal working pace for different types of vessels and different clay conditions. He watched master potters teach apprentices not just hand positions and techniques, but the breathing patterns and mental rhythms that supported sustained, high-quality work. The most skilled craftspeople could adjust their internal tempo based on subtle feedback from the clay itself, speeding up when the material was cooperating, slowing down when it required more careful handling. Apollo began incorporating these insights into his musical instruction, teaching students how to develop their own internal sense of timing rather than relying entirely on external cues. He showed them how to use breathing and physical movement to support their playing, how to listen not just to the sounds they were making, but to the subtle resistance or cooperation of their instruments. These lessons in embodied rhythm proved valuable beyond their immediate musical applications. Students found that the awareness they developed of their own internal rhythms helped them in other areas of life as well. They became more attuned to their natural energy cycles, better able to pace themselves through long projects, more sensitive to the rhythms of the people around them. Apollo's residence in the grove on Mount Parnassus evolved to accommodate his new understanding of divine purpose. Rather than treating it as a private retreat, he began inviting mortal visitors to join him there for extended periods of musical exploration and education. The space became a kind of informal academy, where people from different backgrounds could come together to share their musical traditions and learn from each other. The academy operated on principles quite different from traditional educational institutions. There were no formal curricula or graduation requirements, no hierarchical relationships between teachers and students. Instead, everyone who participated was expected to both share their own knowledge and remain open to learning from others. Apollo served more as a facilitator than an instructor, helping to create conditions where genuine exchange could take place. Musicians arrived carrying instruments and techniques from their home communities, but they also brought stories, cultural contexts, and ways of understanding music's role in human life. A group of traveling merchants might share the songs they used to pass time during long journeys, while mountain dwellers contributed melodies that helped them navigate by sound during foggy weather. Desert peoples brought rhythms that matched the pace of camel caravans, while island folk shared sea chantés that coordinated sailing maneuvers. What emerged from these gatherings was a deeper appreciation for music's universal qualities and its infinite local variations. Participants discovered that while specific melodies and rhythms varied dramatically between cultures, the underlying human needs that music addressed were remarkably consistent. People everywhere used music to coordinate group activities, to process emotions too complex for ordinary speech, to connect with spiritual dimensions of existence, to teach important knowledge to the next generation. These cross-cultural musical exchanges often led to innovations that none of the participants could have achieved working alone. A desert rhythm combined with a mountain melody might produce something entirely new and compelling. An island harmony applied to a farming song might reveal previously hidden emotional depths. The collaborative environment encouraged experimentation and risk-taking that individual musicians might have found too intimidating to attempt on their own. Apollo found himself learning as much from these exchanges as any of the mortal participants. His divine perspective allowed him to perceive patterns and connections that might not be obvious from within any single cultural tradition, but his understanding remained incomplete without the embodied knowledge that came from actually living within those traditions. The combination of divine insight and mortal experience produced insights that neither could have achieved independently. One particularly memorable gathering brought together musicians from communities that had been in conflict with each other for generations. Political tensions made direct diplomatic contact between their peoples difficult, but music provided a language that transcended immediate political concerns. As they shared songs and learned each other's musical traditions, the participants began to recognize the common humanity that underlay their surface differences. This didn't immediately resolve the conflicts between their communities, but it did create personal relationships that helped prevent those conflicts from escalating into violence. Musicians who had spent time together in the grove carried back to their homes a more nuanced understanding of their supposed enemies, making them less susceptible to the kind of dehumanizing rhetoric that typically fueled warfare. Apollo began to understand that music's peacemaking potential wasn't just metaphorical or spiritual. The collaborative skills required for successful musical performance, listening carefully to others, coordinating individual efforts toward shared goals, adjusting one's own contributions based on what the group needed, were exactly the skills required for successful diplomacy and conflict resolution. He started incorporating deliberate peacemaking elements into his musical education, creating exercises that required participants from different backgrounds to work together on complex musical projects. These collaborations forced people to move beyond their assumptions about each other and develop genuine working relationships based on mutual respect and shared creative goals. The success of these musical diplomacy experiments encouraged Apollo to think more broadly about the social applications of artistic education. Music wasn't just entertainment or personal expression, it was a technology for building and maintaining human communities. Understanding how to use it effectively could help societies develop greater resilience, creativity, and harmony. This insight led Apollo to begin working with community leaders who were interested in using music as a tool for social development. He helped them understand how traditional work songs could be adapted to coordinate new types of group projects, how celebratory music could be used to strengthen community identity during periods of change, how contemplative music could provide emotional support during difficult times. These applications required a sophisticated understanding of the relationships between musical structures and social dynamics. Different rhythms encouraged different types of group behavior. Some promoted unified action, others supported individual expression within group contexts. Certain melodic patterns seemed to enhance focus and concentration, while others encouraged relaxation and emotional openness. Apollo's exploration of these connections between music and social psychology represented a new frontier in his divine development. He was learning to see his domain not just as an artistic sphere, but as a fundamental aspect of human civilization. Music wasn't decoration added to life after more basic needs were met. It was one of the tools humans used to meet those basic needs more effectively. As word of Apollo's innovative approach to musical education spread, he began receiving visitors from increasingly distant communities. Some came seeking specific musical knowledge or techniques, but others were drawn by reports of the collaborative learning environment he had created. The Grove became a pilgrimage destination for people who were interested in exploring the deeper possibilities of musical practice. Among these visitors was an elderly woman named Pythia, though not the famous oracle of Delphi who shared that name. This Pythia was a keeper of songs from an isolated mountain community where music served particularly important social functions. In her village, certain melodies were used to help people process grief, others to celebrate major life transitions, still others to facilitate decision-making during community meetings. Pythia's knowledge represented a sophisticated understanding of music's therapeutic and ceremonial applications that impressed even Apollo. She knew songs that could help people access and process traumatic memories, melodies that eased the passage from life to death, rhythms that helped groups reach consensus during difficult discussions. Her musical education had been as comprehensive and demanding as training for any other professional role. "In my village," she explained during one of their evening conversations, "we don't think of music as something separate from healing or governance or spiritual practice. It's woven into everything we do, because we've learned that the right music at the right time can help people accomplish things that would be impossible with words alone." Apollo spent weeks learning from Pythia, discovering musical applications he had never considered despite his divine status. Her knowledge had been developed through generations of careful observation and experimentation, refined through practical application in real community situations. It represented a kind of musical science that was both more empirical and more immediately useful than much of his own divine understanding. This encounter reminded Apollo once again that divine knowledge and mortal wisdom were complementary rather than competitive. His immortal perspective allowed him to see patterns across vast spans of time and space, but mortal experience provided depth and specificity that his divine view sometimes lacked. The most complete understanding came from combining both perspectives. As his reputation as an innovative musical teacher continued to spread, Apollo found himself receiving invitations to visit communities facing particular challenges where music might offer solutions. A trading city, struggling with conflicts between different ethnic groups, asked him to help develop musical traditions that could bridge cultural divides. A farming region, dealing with coordination problems during large harvest projects, wanted assistance creating work songs that would improve efficiency and morale. Each of these consulting engagements taught Apollo something new about the practical applications of musical knowledge. He learned to analyze community problems from a musical perspective, identifying where better coordination, emotional support, or enhanced communication might help, then developing appropriate musical interventions. This work required him to think systematically about the relationships between different musical elements and their social effects. Over time, Apollo began to develop what amounted to a comprehensive theory of applied music, a framework for understanding how specific musical techniques could be used to address particular community needs. This theory drew on his accumulated experience working with dozens of different communities, but it also incorporated insights from collaborative work with skilled mortal practitioners like Pythia. The development of this theoretical framework represented a new level of sophistication in Apollo's divine practice. He was no longer simply responding intuitively to situations as they arose, but thinking strategically about how musical interventions could be designed and implemented to achieve specific social outcomes. This systematic approach made his assistants more effective and allowed him to train others to apply similar techniques in their own communities. As Apollo's work in this area continued to evolve, he began to attract the attention of other Olympian deities who were interested in developing more effective approaches to their own divine responsibilities. Athena, in particular, was curious about how his musical methods might complement her own work with craftspeople and civic organizations. The two began collaborating on projects that combined musical coordination with practical skill building and community development. Their joint efforts proved remarkably successful, demonstrating that different forms of divine expertise could be combined to create interventions more powerful than either could achieve alone. Communities that participated in their collaborative programs developed not just better musical traditions and improved craft skills, but enhanced overall social cohesion and problem-solving capabilities. These successes encouraged other gods to experiment with similar collaborative approaches to their divine work. The pantheon began to function less like a collection of competing individuals and more like a coordinated team working toward shared goals of human flourishing. This shift in divine culture paralleled the changes Apollo had been observing in mortal communities where musical education had helped people learn to work together more effectively. The transformation of both divine and mortal approaches to collaboration represented something unprecedented in the history of the relationship between gods and humans. Rather than maintaining strict hierarchies with power flowing only from immortal to mortal, new patterns were emerging that allowed for genuine exchange and mutual enrichment. Gods learned from mortals. Mortals influenced divine behavior, and both worked together on projects that neither could have accomplished independently. As these new patterns became more established, Apollo found his role evolving once again. He was no longer primarily a teacher or even a facilitator, but something more like a translator or bridge builder, someone who helped divine and mortal perspectives inform and enhance each other. This role required different skills than traditional godhood, less emphasis on commanding and more on listening, less focus on demonstrating power, and more on enabling collaboration. The grove on Mount Parnassus reflected these changes, becoming less a retreat from the world and more a hub of activity that connected divine and mortal realms. Visitors arrived not just seeking musical education, but hoping to contribute to the ongoing development of new approaches to community building and social problem solving. The space buzzed with conversations in multiple languages, experiments with hybrid musical traditions, and planning sessions for collaborative projects that would be implemented in communities scattered across the Mediterranean world. Apollo's transformation from a god who demanded worship through displays of power to one who earned respect through service and collaboration represented a fundamental shift in the nature of divinity itself. He had discovered that true immortality came not from being feared or adored from a distance, but from contributing something of lasting value to the ongoing human conversation about how to live well together. His music would outlive him not because it was divinely perfect, but because it had helped mortals discover and develop their own capacity for creating beauty, meaning, and connection. As evening settled over the grove once again, and the last conversations of the day wound down to comfortable silence, Apollo took up his lyre for a few minutes of purely personal music-making. The melodies that flowed from his strings carried traces of all the voices he had encountered, all the traditions he had learned, all the innovations he had helped facilitate. It was music that belonged neither entirely to the divine nor entirely to the mortal realm, but to the space between them where genuine collaboration had learned to flourish. In the distance, an owl called softly, perhaps Athena's sacred bird, acknowledging the peaceful end of another day of productive work. The stars began to emerge overhead, their ancient patterns reminding Apollo of the eternal rhythms that connected all music, all creativity, all genuine attempts to transform raw experience into something beautiful and meaningful. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new challenges, new opportunities to discover what became possible when gods and mortals worked together as partners in the ongoing creation of a more harmonious world. But for now, it was enough to sit in the gentle darkness, making quiet music in a place where wisdom had learned to wear the comfortable clothes of everyday kindness, where power had discovered the deeper satisfaction that came from lifting others rather than standing above them, where the ancient stories were being rewritten one shared song at a time. The soft sounds of night creatures began their evening chorus around the grove, a gentle reminder that even in the divine realm, the natural rhythms of day and night continued their eternal dance. Apollo set his lyre aside and allowed himself a moment of simple appreciation for the quiet beauty of this place that had become so central to his understanding of what it meant to be a god in service to something larger than himself. As he sat in contemplation, Apollo's thoughts drifted to the countless mortals he had encountered over the years, each one teaching him something valuable about the nature of creativity and connection. There was Marcus, the stone carver who had shown him how the grain of marble could guide the creation of sculptures that seemed to breathe with life. There was Elena, the baker whose bread somehow carried the warmth of her care for her community in every golden crust. There was young Dmitri, barely past childhood, whose simple wooden flute could make even the most hardened warriors weep with homesickness. Each of these encounters had shifted something in Apollo's understanding of his divine purpose. Where once he had sought to demonstrate his superiority through overwhelming displays of musical virtuosity, he now found deeper satisfaction in creating spaces where mortal creativity could flourish. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't always been comfortable. There had been moments of doubt, times when the old patterns of divine behavior had seemed simpler and more familiar than this new path of collaborative engagement. But the results spoke for themselves. Communities that had learned to value and develop their own musical traditions showed remarkable resilience in the face of challenges that might have broken less connected societies. They had developed ways of processing collective grief through song, of celebrating achievements that strengthened community bonds, of making difficult decisions through musical discussions that allowed everyone to contribute their perspective while maintaining harmony. Apollo had begun to document these observations, creating what amounted to a new form of divine knowledge. Rather than the traditional scrolls that recorded mythical events and genealogies of gods and heroes, his writings focused on practical wisdom about how music could serve human flourishing. These texts were being copied and shared among communities throughout the known world, creating networks of connection between groups that had previously had little contact with each other. The impact of this knowledge sharing extended far beyond musical education. Communities that had learned effective collaboration through musical practice found those skills transferring to other areas of life. They developed more efficient approaches to agriculture, more equitable systems for resolving disputes, more innovative solutions to technical challenges. The musical foundation seemed to provide a template for cooperation that enhanced all their other activities. Apollo had also noticed changes in how young people approached learning and creativity. Children who grew up in communities with strong musical traditions showed greater confidence in their ability to contribute meaningfully to group efforts. They were more willing to experiment with new ideas, more resilient when their initial attempts didn't succeed, more generous in supporting the creative efforts of their peers. These observations led Apollo to begin working with communities on what he came to think of as musical education for life skills. Rather than teaching music as a separate subject, he helped communities integrate musical principles into all their educational activities. Children learned mathematics through rhythm, developed language skills through singing, explored history through traditional ballads, and practiced social cooperation through ensemble playing. The results of these integrated approaches were remarkable. Students retained information more effectively when it was embedded in musical contexts. They developed stronger emotional intelligence through participating in musical activities that required them to be sensitive to the moods and needs of others. They gained confidence in their ability to contribute to group efforts and learned to value both individual expression and collective harmony. Apollo began receiving requests from communities throughout the Mediterranean world, asking for assistance in developing these educational innovations. Each request required him to adapt his approach to local conditions and cultural traditions, which continued his own education about the diversity of human creative expression. He learned about rhythmic traditions from African traders, melodic systems from Asian merchants, harmonic approaches from Northern European tribes. This exposure to musical traditions from beyond the classical Greek world expanded Apollo's understanding of what music could be and do. He discovered that his divine domain was far more vast and varied than he had previously realized. Music wasn't a single language that could be mastered once and for all, but an infinite family of languages, each reflecting the particular genius of the people who had developed it. Some of these musical traditions challenged Apollo's basic assumptions about how music worked. Certain cultures used scales and rhythmic patterns that seemed impossible according to Greek musical theory, yet they produced effects of extraordinary beauty and power. Others employed techniques like vocal harmonies or instrumental combinations that created sounds Apollo had never imagined possible. Rather than dismissing these unfamiliar approaches as inferior or incorrect, Apollo applied the lesson he had learned from his work with mortal craftspeople. He approached each new musical tradition with curiosity and respect, seeking to understand its internal logic and appreciate its particular strengths. This openness led to discoveries that enriched his own musical understanding and expanded the range of techniques he could share with the communities he worked with. The integration of diverse musical traditions became another focus of Apollo's work. He helped communities that were experiencing increased contact with foreign cultures develop musical practices that honored their own traditions, while remaining open to beneficial influences from elsewhere. This work required delicate sensitivity to the fears and resistances that often arose when familiar cultural patterns were challenged by new possibilities. Apollo learned to approach these situations not as a teacher imposing solutions from above, but as a facilitator helping communities navigate their own processes of cultural evolution. He would spend time learning about local concerns and aspirations, understanding the historical experiences that shaped people's attitudes toward change, identifying the values and practices that were most essential to preserve. Based on this deep listening, Apollo would then suggest small experiments that allowed communities to explore new possibilities without abandoning their core identity. Perhaps a traditional melody could be accompanied by a rhythm pattern borrowed from a neighboring culture. Maybe a foreign instrument could be incorporated into local ceremonies in ways that enhanced rather than replaced familiar practices. These gradual approaches to cultural integration proved far more successful than attempts to impose change rapidly or wholesale. Communities retained ownership of their evolutionary process and developed greater confidence in their ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. They learned skills for ongoing cultural innovation that served them well as they continued to encounter new influences and opportunities. Apollo's role in these processes required him to develop entirely new forms of divine wisdom. Traditional godhood had been about knowing the right answers and imposing them on mortals who were expected to accept divine authority without question. But this new approach required skills more like those of a counselor or consultant, someone who could ask helpful questions, provide useful information, and support decision-making processes without controlling their outcomes. The development of these facilitative skills transformed Apollo's relationship not only with mortals, but with his fellow Olympians. He found himself applying similar approaches in divine councils, listening more carefully to different perspectives, asking questions that helped clarify underlying concerns, suggesting collaborative approaches to challenges that had previously been addressed through competitive power struggles. Some of the older gods found these changes disturbing. They had grown comfortable with traditional patterns of divine authority, and were suspicious of approaches that seemed to diminish their status or require them to consider mortal perspectives. But others, particularly the goddesses who had often felt marginalized within the traditional power structures, were intrigued by the possibilities that collaborative approaches opened up. Athena had already begun incorporating Apollo's musical methods into her work with craftspeople and civic organizations. Artemis discovered that some of his facilitative techniques were useful in her efforts to protect wilderness areas and the communities that depended on them. Even Aphrodite found that understanding the musical dimensions of emotional connection enhanced her ability to help people develop healthy relationships. These cross-pollinations between different divine domains led to innovations that none of the gods could have achieved working in isolation. Communities began experiencing interventions that addressed multiple dimensions of their challenges simultaneously. A village dealing with economic difficulties might receive assistance that combined improved agricultural techniques, better social coordination, enhanced artistic expression, and stronger emotional support systems. The success of these integrated approaches began to shift the entire culture of Olympus toward more collaborative and service-oriented forms of divine practice. Gods who had previously competed with each other for mortal worship and recognition started working together on projects designed to enhance human flourishing. The pantheon began functioning more like a coordinated team and less like a collection of rival power centers. This transformation of divine culture had profound effects on the mortal world as well. As gods became more skilled at working together and more focused on genuine service to human communities, the quality of divine intervention improved dramatically. Mortals experienced divine assistance as more helpful, more respectful of their autonomy, and more supportive of their own capacity for growth and development. The old patterns of divine behavior, based on demands for worship and punishment of perceived slights, began to seem increasingly archaic and counterproductive. Communities that had experienced the newer forms of divine collaboration were less interested in relationships based on fear and submission. They sought partnerships with gods who respected their dignity and supported their aspirations rather than demanding their subservience. This shift in mortal expectations created pressure for all the gods to evolve their approaches to divine practice. Those who clung to traditional authoritarian methods found themselves increasingly isolated and irrelevant. Their temples received fewer offerings, their festivals drew smaller crowds, their influence on human affairs diminished. Meanwhile, gods who embraced collaborative approaches found their relationships with mortal communities growing stronger and more mutually beneficial. And so, we reach the end of our gentle journey through the quieter corners of Mount Olympus, where wisdom and music found their truest expressions not in grand displays of power, but in moments of simple connection and shared understanding. Tonight, we've seen Athena not as the fearsome warrior goddess, but as the patient observer who found divinity in a potter's careful hands and a teacher's thoughtful questions. We've walked with Apollo not as the blazing chariot driver, but as the humble musician who discovered that the most beautiful songs emerge when gods and mortals create together as equals. These stories remind us that even in the realm of the divine, the most profound transformations happen quietly, in olive groves at dawn and mountain meadows at twilight, wherever genuine care meets honest work. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voices and the brightest flames, perhaps there's wisdom in remembering that sometimes the deepest magic lies in simply paying attention, in listening carefully, and in finding the extraordinary beauty that lives within ordinary moments. Sweet dreams, and may your own quiet moments be filled with the gentle wisdom of gods who learned that true power comes not from commanding fear, but from nurturing the seeds of creativity and connection that exist in every human heart.